Welcome back to another episode of C4NPR Chat. If we haven't yet met, I'm Heather Bradley. I'm the director of the Center for Nonprofit Resources, and I'm delighted to have Michelle Zaru with us today. Welcome, Michelle.
Hi. How are you?
Good. Michelle is an attorney with Shoemaker, Lupin, Kendrick, and this is part of a great collaboration we have with Toledo Bar Association where attorneys with various expertise areas come and help us understand complex issues that we are dealing with as leaders of nonprofits. So for those of you who are responsible for policy making for your nonprofit, you're going to be particularly interested because today Michelle is going to address the question, really employment issues around the COVID-19, which we're starting to see being dispensed and administered throughout our community. So Michelle, do you want to say a few words before we get started?
Sure. I'm happy to be here. I'm just finished my service as a member of the Toledo Board of Directors, Toledo Bar Association Board of Directors, so we're really happy about this partnership. I have been working in employment and labor for 20 years. I'm in my 20th year, and this year has been like no other. We've had all kinds of questions about COVID, return to work, Families First Act, vaccines. So really, I'm happy to answer questions on all of it or any of it and help your members, get through this time. So just let me know, what I can do.
Yeah, great. Do you want to put any caveats on the information you'll be sharing today?
Sorry. Yes. Just to be clear, this is just generally a discussion, not to be construed as legal advice. If you really have a situation that you need advice on, we should address that separately so I can have all the facts and make a informed, give you informed information and not just off the fly tell you something. So
right, because every organization is different. But I think these are some of the core questions that we, particularly as employers, are starting to ask. So let's start with probably a question lots of people have. Can an employer mandate that employees receive the COVID-19 vaccine?
The short answer is yes. The long answer is maybe they shouldn't. As a practical matter, maybe that's not the best idea just yet. There are a lot of considerations that go into mandating the vaccine. First of all, if you're in a unionized workplace, you may have to bargain with your union about whether to mandate the vaccine or not, because that could be considered, a mandatory subject to bargaining and term and condition employment. That's one consideration. The other is you have to make exemptions to your policy for people who might have a disability or who might have a religious belief, a sincerely held religious belief that prevents them from taking the vaccine. Well, those exceptions can sometimes swallow the rule and defeat the purpose of mandating the vaccine. And it causes a lot of administrative difficulty to sort through those requests to determine, who you have to accommodate and how you will accommodate them, but you do have a duty to do that. The third reason why I'm hesitant to say you should go ahead and do it is that you have to collect, sometimes to do the vaccine, to give the vaccine, you have to collect certain medical information just to make sure that there's not a reason not to have the vaccine. And that can lead to triggering different requirements on the genetic information non-discrimination law, we call it GINA, and the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. So there's a couple of laws you would have to comply with to collect that information before you even give the vaccine. Some of that can be avoided by having a third-party provider give the vaccine. And then the other consideration is if there are side effects from the vaccine, that could become a workers' comp claim. So that could create some concerns there if you don't want your workers' comp premiums to go up. And finally, I have a concern just generally about mandating a vaccine that currently is only authorized under a limited emergency use authorization. It's not really formally licensed. So I think now is not the time to mandate it. Maybe once it's formally licensed and it's been tested and we know what the adverse effects are with more information and a full FDA licensing, it would be safer to do so at that point. I think the better approach is to make it voluntary, maybe even make it available on site through a third-party provider, but not necessarily mandate it at this point. I think it's just a little premature and there's just too many risks involved.
Okay. And I would assume that policies would have to be updated for the provision. Should someone decline that mandated vaccine, what happens then?
Right. And you have to get into, are they declining because of a disability, because of religious belief, or just because they don't want to? And how are you going to treat them? And then what if a significant portion of your employees decline and all of a sudden you don't have workers to do your work? And that's a realistic problem for, especially, in a plant setting. Like, that could be disastrous. In a nonprofit, you might be able to hobble through with volunteers or whatnot, but it's still, you could be taken by surprise if 15 of your 20 people say they won't do it.
Right.
That's a huge headache you just created, for what gain when, a lot of the companies have been doing pretty well with social distancing, masks, telework, and whatever combination of those measures. So it's to me, I think it's not something to be undertaken lightly. The Lucas County Department of Health is starting a program where they're going to actually partner with large employers to provide the vaccine on site. I think that offers a little more protections, because that can put you under what's known as the PrEP Act, which is a federal statute that limits some liability related to administering vaccines. Arguably, it's not fully determined that law would cover you. But I don't know if that program is going to be available to smaller nonprofits. So right. I still don't love the idea of having it be mandatory.
Yeah. So speaking of what we call the V Project, that's what we all affectionately call it. I'm going to put a link in the description below for that. The center doesn't have a lot of answers yet, but we are working on a subcommittee specifically focused on the nonprofits. So as we get information related to the vaccine project or the V Project, we will certainly pass that along. So if that's of interest to you, particularly as an employer, you can watch for information that we receive that we'll push through to all of you. So speaking of liability, if an employer does not mandate that their employees receive the vaccine, are they exposed to any liability if their employees pass the virus on to clients? So for example, if it's someone with a homeless shelter or a daycare, is there any liability there? Do we know?
There is not in Ohio. The Ohio General Assembly passed a statute, and Governor DeWine signed it, that limits liability for employers unless they act with gross negligence. That for any, it's very broadly worded, so it's any kind of impacts related to the pandemic, they are immune from liability, and they can, so I think it would be under the terms of that statute. To just not mandate a vaccine is not enough to reach that gross negligence kind of stage. If the employer is not mandating vaccines, not using masks, not socially distancing, not using sanitizing procedures, and not doing anything to prevent transmission, then that statute may not protect them. But as long as they're taking the reasonable steps that we've all been taking in order to operate these past 9 months, then they should be protected by that statute from any liability, and it's pretty broad.
So from the other side of the house, can an employer or a nonprofit organization require that their clients, say a shelter or a daycare, be vaccinated? Can they require it of their clients?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can't think of a reason why they couldn't, you know what I mean? Because there's even fewer protections of the clients than the employees. Again, I think I would want to wait until there's a more formal license for the vaccine and we're more aware of what all the side effects are. But I think they could. The concern I would have is, are the clients competent to take the vaccine, or to make that decision to take the vaccine in order to receive services? And if they're not competent to do so, I would want to make sure their guardians or someone was making that decision. I think that raises some issues there.
Well, and if you're willing, I know a lot of the things we've talked about, so we just don't know yet. It's not uncommon for attorneys such as yourself to make a return visit, because we're asking questions and we really don't even have the answers yet to some of them.
Absolutely. Yeah. And this, especially with COVID, the pace in which the information is changing is just unbelievable. So I will give advice and say, but let's talk next week, because I guarantee we're going to have guidance by next week or the week after. And usually we do. So I would be happy to come back, and I'll certainly help send you stuff to keep your website updated.
Yeah,
And
we'll pass
another
those
thing,
along.
just a little plug for my firm, Shoemaker, Lupin, Kendrick. We have a COVID-19 resource page where we've been
Mhm.
doing a lot of client alerts, and there's great information on there about the CARES Act, the PPP loans, the COVID vaccines. I'm about to post
Yeah.
something there on this. So, I can send you that link if you want to post it, just
Yeah,
because it's a good
because
legal
we'll add it
resource.
to, we have a COVID page too. So we'll add, and I think we have some of your alerts linked on
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it is happening at such a crazy rate. And even things like a provisional use, emergency use for the vaccine.
Right.
I mean,
What is that?
as you said.
What does that
Okay.
even mean?
So in the scenario that an employee tests positive for COVID, can an employer mandate a test before they return to their work site?
Absolutely. And this is something that was very nerve-wracking for employers at the beginning of the pandemic. And then a few weeks in, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which governs, our civil rights laws and the Americans with Disabilities Act, which I call the ADA, they issued guidance that made it clear you can mandate a test. What you can't mandate is an antibody test to show that someone already had the virus. And then make an employment decision based on that test, because that doesn't show current threat of harm. It shows a history of having the disease, which is not appropriate to rely on. So, but you can just require a test that shows whether they're currently positive or not before they come back, and employers have been doing that. You can also require like a fitness for duty from a doctor, and the only caveat there in the EEOC guidance is that, given how overrun the hospitals and doctors are, maybe you should accept a lesser form of documentation than your personal form filled out. So an email or just a note, a handwritten note. A lot of employers like to use their form, but in this pandemic era, the government agencies have all been pretty consistent in saying, let's accept, lesser documentation.
Yeah. So I know that your clients have been asking lots of questions. Is there anything else that you think we should talk about today while we have you here?
Yeah, I think it's important to understand the Families First Act leave requirements that govern small employers when employees need to take leave due to COVID, whether it's the symptoms or they have a concern related to COVID, having been exposed, something like that. Those provisions ended on December 31st, but in the CARES Act, the latest stimulus bill that the government just passed, they allow employers to still offer that paid leave, those 80 hours and the 12 weeks of extended FMLA, and still get the tax credit through March 31st. I think that's a great benefit especially to nonprofits who want to be able to help their employees and not sure that they're able to do so.
Yeah.
They would have to follow all of the dictates of that statute that they've already been following or should have been following, and still submit to get the tax credit for the next 3 months. Even though they're not required to do that, they do have the option to do so. And I think it's really helpful for a lot of employers.
Great.
Yeah.
All great insights, Michelle. We're all trying to figure it out together.
I know. It's so.
Yeah,
it's
thank
so
you. Thank
crazy.
you for joining us. I know that the nonprofit community is very grateful when attorneys such as yourself can come and help us try and make sense of this.
Yeah.
So I hope, so go ahead.
I was just going to offer one more thing on, questions that I've been getting this week. It seems like they come in waves, but another question has been about workers' comp for COVID. If someone gets COVID and they believe they contracted it at the workplace. So we're seeing the BWC start to allow some of those claims.
Oh, you are? Okay.
Yeah. And that's not, to me, the client I heard this from was a healthcare facility. So it's more likely that the BWC is going to approve a claim for a healthcare facility. The standard for whether a virus such as this can be a workers' comp claim is whether your employment subjected you to a greater risk than the public generally faces. So with a healthcare facility, if they have interaction with COVID patients, then they're going to meet that test. And so now we're seeing that the BWC is allowing that. And the tougher case will be the office workers and people who don't have patient care responsibilities.
Mm-hmm.
But that becomes, a concern for everybody when BWC starts allowing this, or maybe it's better because people are getting their healthcare covered. Yeah. So I just want to throw that out there, that that's still something that if you get a claim filed by someone who contracted COVID, that it would be good to talk to an attorney and get some advice about whether this is something you can ultimately prove
Right.
should
So,
not be a claim.
yeah, related issue then, when people ask you about sign-in procedures, when people report to work, what
Right.
guidance are you giving them on that topic?
We have made forms for people to fill out. Have you been exposed to anyone? You really just want to ask about exposure to anyone, not just family members, because then you get into that GINA territory, the Genetic Information Act. But ultimately, the questionnaires are fine because they have a business purpose and they're job related. The temperature taking, the EEOC has been fine, although how effective is it? I don't know. You may catch some people that way though. And before they can transmit it. And, ensuring that they have their mask and they understand your policies is always a good idea as well. So the screening procedures when they're trying to enter the business, that's what you're asking about, right? Those are all, to me, those are the steps you can take. And it's been working pretty well actually. And people are getting used to the fact that they have to go into a business and fill out the form and sign and all of those things.
Yeah, what also had me think of it was, I would assume for contact tracing, that's a valuable document. And as it relates to a workers' comp claim, because I don't know, I just think that would be
it's
an
very
extra
helpful.
piece of data.
Yeah, and from the worker side of it, it's really important to know who they had contact with and whether they had contact with anyone outside of their workplace who might have exposed them to the virus rather than inside. And it gets complicated because the first person who gets it may not have gotten it at work, but if they transmit it to two coworkers, then those two coworkers almost definitely have a workers' comp claim if there are greater risks at their workplace. So they could have a claim, but the original person could not. And that's very interesting.
That's the need for an attorney.
Exactly, which is why, I just say if this starts, if this happens and you're at all worried about the workers' comp claim, then get us in at the ground floor because we can do a lot more if we are there at the start of the claim and we can build the case. And right, the contact tracing is going to help quite a bit. In my law firm, actually, they handed out pads to us to write down our symptoms every day and who we contacted every day just to keep a daily record when we're in the office. Now, how many people are using those? I don't know, but they made a little notepad with all the questions on there and handed it out to everyone to try. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Well, Michelle, thank you so much for joining us. And for those of you out there, we hope you join us for another episode of C4NPR Chats. We will definitely, because I'm going to make up, things are going to be really busy legally in the next month or so as we have change of administrations and who knows what's happening. So we're going to need some help navigating all that. So I hope you join us for another episode and you can check out the links that are below in the descriptions. Hope you have a great week.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.